Kia ora koutou, no mai, and welcome to our online panel discussion for today. I just want to start by thanking you all for coming at the end of what I'm sure was a very busy day, busy Monday in week 10 of the term, the teaching term for those of you who are teachers. And, thank you for just taking some time to enrich your practice with NZATE. Hopefully enriching your practice and just tuning in. We really appreciate it. Ko Sam Oldham Topuingoa. I am an English teacher at Mount Maunganui College in Tauranga. And I am research chair at NZATE. I have the hardest job today, which is to introduce the panel. I just wanted to quickly start by very quickly introducing the topic for our panel discussion today, which is the science of learning as it sort of applies to English teachers. So science of learning has become a really important set of ideas that we are now being expected to use to guide our teaching. It appears in our new curriculum documents. It's very prominent in many of the policy announcements of our coalition government and within the Ministry of Education more broadly. I'm going to let the panel talk a bit about what science of learning sort of is. And we put it in capitals because it is a bit of a brand name in some ways. There is no sort of one science of learning as some people on our page did point out. But that's sort of the name that it's been given. The Ministry of Education defines it as the science of how people learn, bringing together robust evidence from all sorts of different fields, biology, cognitive science, and so on. Quite a diffuse definition. And we see this, this really big focus on neuroscience, the role of memory in the learning process. We've heard a lot about cognitive load. I'm sure people are getting sick of some of these terms in the PLDs they might have been having within schools. We have this big focus on the importance of knowledge. And we've gone back to this sort of the importance of explicit instruction in our teaching, which of course is a shift away from the previous focus, which had a lot to do with inquiry learning and student self-direction, which I think has been quite an interesting shift. So what we wanted to do is hear from three academics who have taken a somewhat critical view on science of learning. There is a really good basic overview or set of overviews on the Ministry of Education website. Someone like Dr. Nina Hood is a really good, prominent local expert. The panel today was organised by the NZATE Research Committee, which works to bring together the world of academic research and classroom teaching for English teachers. So we wanted to hear from some academics, and Andrew still has a foot in the classroom, which is awesome as well. And so on the panel today, we have Hyejeong Ahn. Hyejeong is a senior lecturer in languages and literacy in the Faculty of Education at the University of Melbourne. Her research examines language ideologies, world Englishes, and primary literacy education with a particular focus on linguistic legitimacy and equity in English-dominant educational settings. She has led major curriculum and policy initiatives and publishes internationally on linguistics and literacy education. Alex Bacalja is a senior lecturer in English and literacy education at the University of Melbourne and has been involved in ITE, initial teacher education, for over a decade. He has a really rich body of research in network ethnography informed by socio-cultural literacies and post-digital thinking. And his research interests are around digital technologies, young people's literacy practices, and the development and impact of English and literacy policy development. And Andrew Thompson is a specialist classroom teacher and teacher of English in Tāmaki Makaurau. He recently received his doctorate from the University of Auckland in 2023, specialising in contemporary progressive educational ideals and their limits. And he is also a member of NZATE's Research Committee and a convener of NZARE's Educational Ideas Special Interest Group. So I am going to be quiet now and hand over to Alex, and we're going to try and get it all wrapped up by 4:30. And if anyone has questions, I'm sure our presenters won't mind answering a few questions at the end. Alex.
Thank you, Sam. Kia ora, everyone. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded land on which I work and live. These are the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Boonwurrung's peoples. I want to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the academy and in the field of English teaching, of which we're all members of. My name's Alex. I'm here with my colleague Hyejeong. We're here because, like teachers and teacher educators all over Australasia, perhaps all over the Anglophone world, we've had to engage with uh, this almost explosion of interest in the science of learning and its associated concepts, and we'll get into them in a moment, and the impacts of that explosion in terms of mandates, policy changes, curriculum changes, etc. It's not just happening in New Zealand. It's happening quicker in some places than other places. In some places, it's felt more intensely than other places. And Hyejeong and I have been working deeply in this space, looking at policy documents, looking at curriculum documents. We've had to prepare thousands of lesson plans for the Victorian government that are underpinned by the science of learning, which has been an interesting experience. And so we hope reflecting on some of our research might offer something for all of you. And my background is as an English teacher. I spent 10 years teaching English in Victoria. And so I hope to be able to make some connections to the work that all of you do every day. So we have three aims today. We want to organise these three aims around complexities. So Hyejeong will begin by focusing on conceptual complexity, looking at some of these key terms or concepts that are being thrown around and associated with the science of learning. I then want to reflect on some research I've done on the science of learning networks and science of learning knowledge brokers, and I would call this kind of political complexities. And then both Hyejeong and I are going to return together to talk about practical implications, or what we might call pedagogic complexities. So we think these three areas are each distinct but also interrelated. Over to you, Hyejeong.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everyone. So, as Sam and Alex mentioned, science of learning has become one of the most influential ideas in educational context today. But to understand why it matters so much, we probably need a little bit of historical context. So over the past few decades, educational debates have shifted from reading wars to the phonics war, now more about debates about learning itself. So let's briefly trace the trajectory, beginning what many of us know as reading wars, the often passionate debates about how best to teach reading to young children. So at the risk of sometimes oversimplifying, these debates are often framed as whole language versus phonics, or meaning focus versus code focus approach to reading instruction. But more recently, these debates have shifted into what I've been, along with other colleagues, been calling the phonics war. The question is no longer whether phonics matters. Scholars have largely settled that phonics is very important, but rather what kinds of phonics instruction is most effective, more of a pedagogical debate. So much of these debates has centered on systematic synthetic phonics, so-called SSP, or versus broader other systematic or combined approach to phonics instruction. But what we are seeing is a broader shift. So earlier this month, The Age, one of the Australia's major newspapers, declared that this heading, the reading war's over, but the learning wars are just beginning. So what is striking is that this debate is no longer centered primarily on reading. Instead, it is more concerned with how learning itself should occur, often framed as a dichotomy between inquiry-based versus explicit approach to teaching. What is also interesting about these wars, reading wars or phonics wars or learning wars, are not simply there is disagreement about pedagogy. It is the language being used to frame this disagreement. As you can see on the slide, where I took a screenshot of social media post, in some public discussion, inquiry-based approach are no longer presented as merely less effective, They are characterized as unethical, educational malpractice, or even harmful to children, drawing analogy with the smoking campaigns. So the key point of this debate is this use of language or this debate have not simply appeared out of nowhere, but rather they've evolved, expanded over time. It's nothing new, moving from rather questions about reading to questions about phonics, now much broader questions about how learning should occur and how teaching should be conducted. So next slide. I'm sure now in the field in these days, the term renaissance, there are so many educational terms you probably come across in the past couple of years. So next. So I want to check some of your prior knowledge. What are any terms using your chat box, if you can participate through your chat, which of these terms are not supported by science of learning approach? Can you give me a quick, I'm checking your prior knowledge here. Can we use our chat tool to tell me if any of these terms for sure that you don't think is supported by current understanding of science of learning? I give you 2 minutes. Experiential learning, okay. And you want an inquiry? Good, thank you, Amy. Oh, okay, Sam, okay, good. I'm checking prior knowledge here, whole language. Oh, very good. Okay, responsive teaching. Okay, so we are giving a very good go here. So before I giving you my understanding of science learning is that science learning is highly developed, complex theories and pedagogy. So I'm not saying what I'm presenting today is definitely supported or not supported by science learning. It is broadly ballpark, largely or less largely. That's what I'm about here. So next, and let's look at the answers. So, safely speaking, I say the ones in the blue box are largely supported by science learning scholars, studies, and red is probably not, the whole, what, depending on how you define whole language, but it is not largely, I can say safely, people within the field of science learning do not believe in whole language approach. The purple, sciences of learning, Sam touched upon this at the beginning. Sciences of learning with a plural S rather than science of learning. Inquiry approach is purple, blue plus red makes it purple. So this is where the debates are happening. Within the social media, inquiry approach is definitely not. Many policy document, inquiry approach may not be encouraged, but within the studies and science learning, within the scholarly debate, inquiry-based approach can be supported science learning as long as explicit teaching is taught. Fundamental skills of students are taught through explicit teaching first. At the last stage of learning, students can go on with inquiry-based project as long as students have fundamental skills developed through explicit teaching. So inquiry-based approach was aimed to develop problem-solving skills within the science learning study context. Although this is, again, some within the field of science learning, some disagree, some do agree. So this is just what's happening within the field of studies. Policy may not always reflect those things, but I'm presenting some of the studies that I've been reading. And also experiential learning, balanced literacy, it's red, yellow, orangish, but closer to red. Again, depending on how you want to looking at what is experiential learning, what's the focus of experiential learning, and how can be taught. Again, it's up for the debate again. So I'm not saying this is definite or not, but this is largely, but definitely science of reading, structured literacy, ET, cognitive load theory, these sort of things are largely supported by science for learning. Next slide. Okay, I have a big task. I have to provide you a bit of an overview of science learning within next 2 minutes. So probably you understand some of these things. So science learning is interdisciplinary field that tries to answer two fundamental questions. How does learning occur? And how can instruction support that learning? To answer these questions, researchers within the field of science learning drawn evidence from different fields, including cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience, linguistic, education study, you name them, you know. But largely cognitive scientists within the field of psychology, cognitive psychology, neuroscience is field leading the science learning, supported by many other fields. Thing that I really want to emphasize here within the field of science learning is that there is a theories of learning and theories of teaching. Theories of learning on the left-hand side, red box. Theories of teaching on the right-hand side, within the blue box. They are different. This distinction is very important. So the theories of learning help understand the mechanism behind the learning. So for example, cognitive scientists examining, human cognitive architecture, examining how working memory and long-term memory interact, how attention works, how much new information learners can process, and how knowledge is stored and retrieved. So, although also it doesn't get much of attention, it also looking at the impact of social media interaction on language development too. How children's language development is supported through communication interaction with adults, for example. And within the literacy field, the reading model, so-called the simple view of reading, is proposed within, it explains reading comprehension is product of decoding and linguistic comprehension. So it helps us to understand process involved in successful reading. However, reading instruction and reading model does not tell us how reading should be taught. For example, decoding said decoding is important, but it doesn't dictate how decoding should be taught. This is a distinction is very, very important. So theory of learning explains mechanism of learning. Theories of teaching ask how we design instruction to support those mechanisms in classrooms. So questions that we need to answer based on these theories: how much new information should we introduce at once? How should the learning be sequenced? How much guidance do we need to provide to our students? Or how should the instruction change depending on students' prior knowledge stored in long-term memory? And some of instructional model proposed by the scholars within the science of learning include, cognitive load theory. You can see on the left box, right blue box. A cognitive load theory, explicit teaching, direct instruction, structured literacy, knowledge-rich curriculum. I won't be able to go through all these details, but many of them they are interacting with each other. So cognitive load theory, for example, explains working memory has a limited capacity. So instruction should avoid unnecessary cognitive overload, or structured literacy, which is really emphasized within Victoria in Australia. It's supported by cognitive load theory, supported by explicit teaching and direct instruction. So it proposed that it is most effective to teach literacy through compartmentalization of skills. For example, we teach vocabulary for particular minutes, grammar for a few minutes. So we compartmentalize skill literacy within particular skill subset. So the key message that I like to provide in today's talk is that theories of learning help us understand how learning occurs, but translating that knowledge into effective classroom teaching require additional research, educational research based in classroom. And that interpretation, can be rather messy because the classroom is messy. This is why educators may agree on principles of science learning, but they have still huge debates about the pedagogy. The last concept, this is concept that I really want you to take away from today's overview of science learning. Can we look at the memory one? So useful, way to think about memory is that, to imagine long-term memory as a library and working memory as a desk where we do our current thinking. So when we learn something new, we bring information onto the desk, work with it, connect with it, what we already know, gradually store into the library. The challenge is that the desk is quite small. It has limited capacity. So when too much information is introduced at once, working memory can be overloaded. So if a student's working memory is overloaded, they may struggle to understand the new content. The information may be not successfully transferred into long-term memory. But unlike short working memory, the long-term memory has much greater capacity. So as a student builds knowledge in long-term memory, they develop stronger connections and larger chunks of information. And this allows them to process increasingly complex ideas more efficiently. So the goal of teaching for example, cognitive load theory in science of learning is to support students moving from effortful processing in working memory towards organized knowledge stored in long-term memory. That's the overview of a science learning today. And then now I transfer that to Alex. Thank you.
Okay, so Hyejeong's been focusing on the conceptual complexities around the science of learning, and I want to pivot to talk about the political complexities. And I became interested in science of learning paradigms through some research I was doing looking at how Australian and New Zealand state and federal education ministers were using language to underpin literacy reform, educational reform. And it was through this work I kept coming across the same kind of phrases, and in particular, one from our federal education minister. The reading wars are over, we know what works. And this phrase is just, it's everywhere. And it started to make its way across the Tasman over to some of the ways that your education minister was speaking about literacy education and literacy reform. So I wanted to better understand where this sudden and nationwide, almost global push for science of learning and science of reading was coming from. And to do that, I conducted what's called a social network analysis. So a social network analysis is a particular research methodology that focuses on understanding the relationships and interactions between entities. They can be individuals, groups, concepts, they can be just about anything. And the aim is to identify the patterns and relationships between these entities. And so in this case, I was interested in the patterns and relationships between those individuals and organizations pushing for science of learning based policy reforms. And what you can see here is a visual that captures some of what we found. So what we see here is a densely interconnected Australian science of reading policy network. It's made up of 15 organizations, including what I call boundary spanning individuals that make strategic partnerships. They facilitate the circulation of specific ideas around literacy discourse, around teaching and learning. And importantly, they also marginalize approaches that don't fit within their paradigm. So on this screen, the orange circles represent important individuals. The blue squares represent specific organizations. Some are not for profit, many of them are for profit. And the lines indicate a kind of affiliation or connection. So what you can see is a highly connected network where some organizations and individuals are particularly important for joining up the network. Here you can see another visual representation of the network where specific organizations occupy strategically central positions in the network. They connect other organizations, they facilitate the flow of influence and policy ideas. And you might recognize some of these organizations because many of their CEOs and founders have spent a fair bit of time in New Zealand over the last 18 months supporting Minister Stanford's new directions regarding the best ways to teach. And finally, we found that this network is held together discursively through language. So there are specific concepts related to evidence, the science of reading, science of learning, and explicit teaching. And these have become a kind of shibboleth, a kind of code word for those who wish to portray themselves as possessing the right answers or the answers to questions about best practice and best teaching. The second body of work we did looked at some specific events. So we did a digital ethnography focusing on 3 key events. The curriculum roadshow that you guys had in October last year, which was itself 4 events, and 2 summits that took place in Australia. And our aim here was to focus on 4 specific individuals, what we call transnational knowledge brokers. and to understand their role in joining up the network. What kind of discourses were being used,
Hi, Delane.
assembled, moved across borders. These were the four individuals we focused on. Natalie Wexler, an author and advocate for Knowledge Rich, and Nathaniel Swain, an Australian academic and founder of a teacher network and professional learning platform. He's written a book called The Science of Learning, your own federal education minister, and a former UK schools minister. So what do we find through this digital ethnography work? Well, we found that these transnational knowledge brokers engaged in repeated keynotes, mutual endorsements. They engaged in kind of a form of amplification of particular ideas. They were really effective at using social media to create a pervasive and durable message that represented itself as a consensus. We also found that these brokers deliberately linked up different parts of the network. So they built connectedness. Ministers were connected to think tanks, were connected to system leaders, and this created pathways for the flow of ideas, both across borders and within borders. We found that the transnational actors were very selective in transplanting particular policy fragments, so bits of policies, whether it was synthetic phonics, knowledge-rich, cognitive load theory, and they moved these ideas across borders at particular times to suit convenience or who they were meeting with, and then recombined them in other places to create the illusion of coherence. And finally, these brokers translated theory into accessible tools or forms of future practice. They used tools like books, podcasts, and especially professional learning to help uptake, even though this meant oversimplifying what they were advocating for. So one of our concerns is that the needs of the network, of this particular network, needs which include making money, to be seen to be doing something, or to simply to remain influential, that this is reducing something that is incredibly complex, as you saw from Hyejeong's visual representation of the science of learning. The network, in order to do what it needs to do, reduces that complexity to kind of digestible sound bites, to simple things. And this can have a lot of negative effects, just one of which is the deprofessionalization of teachers. So in other words, we see political complexity butting up against pedagogical complexity. And this is a nice segue to hand back over to Hyejeong to talk about explicit teaching and give a couple of examples of the forms that explicit teaching might be taking as a result of this tension between political complexity and pedagogic complexity.
Thank you, Alex. Oh, thank you. So I'm going to give you one example of what science learning lesson plan should look like. So this is not the only example, but this is example produced by Victorian Department of Education in Australia. So supported by principles of science learning, explicit teaching, and not so much direct instruction, although the feature of direct instruction, explicit instruction is really, really, there are a lot of overlapping features. So this is year 7 lesson plan, looking at the visual elements of a print advertisement. It's lesson 2 out of 20 lesson sequence units. And let's look at the learning objective. We will identify, describe how advertisement use visual feature, including color, size, and salience to persuade the target audience to buy products and services. This is a lesson plan objective. Next slide. So I won't be able to, you can get this lesson plan from ARC, Victorian website. It's very freely, publicly available. So it's a 60-minute lesson plan. This is one example. So first 5 minutes, we are asking, activating prior knowledge by, we are looking at the instructional verb here today. So ask a student, extend by asking, check for understanding by choosing non-volunteer. So in science learning, choosing non-volunteer is a very important strategy. They are asking. Then modeling takes another 20 minutes. Explain, recall, explain, list. Explicitly teach vocabulary, then discuss and ask a student to read together and explain. Then explicitly teach vocabulary, particular vocabulary. Then you can choose volunteer because you taught them. Unless you teach them, they did not want to use volunteers. Then guided practice. Again, largely teacher-led instructions. Verbs such as explain, explain, present, and then ask students, explain, explain, explain. And then final stage of independent instruction for 10 minutes. Again, providing models and ask and scaffold extend, and final 5 minutes. Review and reflect. The review of learning objectives and success criteria by rereading it aloud, and quickly write and ask students summarize key learning and new knowledge learned in this lesson by writing 3 dot points in their workbooks. This is one example of, I'm not here to criticize, to evaluate this lesson plan. I need another hour or so. But as an English teacher, you can have a look. This is one example how science learning can be unfolded in your classroom. How are you gonna take this into your classroom? What imagine, I'll give you food for thought for you by giving you this example. Thank you.
So one of our concerns, or one of my concerns, is that this all in on the science of reading, and perhaps the oversimplification of what is happening in the science of reading, is leading to a kind of an all in on explicit teaching. And that's problematic for a number of reasons. I think one way to demonstrate why this all in is dangerous is to look at a number of ways that we might teach a text in English. And so if we can consider Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and I know Shakespeare's topical right now because of changes to your national curriculum and what might be mandated, but we can see immediately through an example like theatre and a text that is a play, how a number of different ways of building understanding and knowledge are important. If we were to take a group of students to see a performance of Romeo and Juliet, a kind of experiential learning, I think many would see the benefits of this. If we were to ask students to perform in the play Romeo and Juliet, to take on particular roles, to learn their lines, to get dressed up, to learn the stagecraft, a kind of embodied learning would be, enacted, which most of us would see as beneficial for understanding and knowledge. And likewise, if I was to use some worked examples, a PowerPoint slide deck, to demonstrate to students how to learn to write analytical sentences, an example of explicit teaching, I think many of us would take the position that this is also an important way to build knowledge around Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet in the context of a secondary English classroom. So we think there's room for more nuance to look at what kinds of approaches to teaching, when these might be appropriate, for what purpose. And I'm going to jump forward just a little bit, because one way to answer this question around, how do we respond, is to turn to one of your own gurus and one of my favorites, and that's Terry Locke. And I just want to take 2 quotes from Terry's work to make what's probably our final point here, because we're running out of time. But Terry was responding to debates in the English field around the paradigms of English. And lots of us love to use this notion that there are 4 paradigms of school English. There's the personal growth approach, cultural heritage, critical literacy, and skills. And we use these as kind of frames to talk about subject English. And what Terry's saying in this first quote, the reality is far more complex. He's saying no one really subscribes and entirely dedicates their classroom to just one of these paradigms. He says a range of factors contribute to the formation of English teachers' knowledge and classroom practice. And then he encourages us to take a position which is informed and critically eclectic. So he advocates for critical eclecticism. And I think this is a really good reminder of the value of recognizing, of moving beyond the idea that there's only one version of English, or that a version of English that is supported by the science of learning is the only way. Rather to be aware that, all approaches have particular ideological underpinnings, and there will be opportunities or moments in our practice that will benefit from the whole suite or range of ways in which we might contribute to knowledge and understanding in the English classroom. To finish up, just a final word on policy making. So what you guys and us on this side of the Tasman have been experiencing is a lot of government policy making. And government's always had this role. The government makes policy through curriculum change and specific policies that impact what we can do. And this is generally accepted as a role of government. They make policy. We also have this right now, this particular group of new policy actors being incredibly influential. And that's what some of my work has found. And I'm sure you guys have also found that there are particular groups of actors or new policy actors that have had a lot of influence. And you saw some of them in the policy network I visualized earlier. I know you've got your own group like Liz Kane, Literacy Learning Matters. And I'm not judging any of these groups because I've put NZATE there as well. These are particular policy actors that shape what becomes of policy. But we should remember that teachers also have a central role in policy making, and this can take two forms. One can be speaking back to policy, where policy drafts are released, curriculum drafts are released, being active in our communities, writing to journalists, etc. But once we close the door to our classrooms, we're also becoming policy makers. So something that might be mandated, what it actually becomes is something that will happen inside of our classroom. And so even when there are mandates that seem insurmountable, we still have a role to turn those policies into something in the context of our classroom. I'm going to hand over to Andrew in a second. I do want to say that Hyejeong and I are looking to recruit a PhD student. So if you have a particular interest in pursuing research that's focused on the science of learning, the science of reading, this particular time of rapid and intense policy formation, feel free to scan the QR code, check some of the details, see if you're eligible, and to get in touch with us. And with that, I will hand over to Andrew.
I'm just going to very quickly interject before Andrew picks up. Alex and Hyejeong, thank you so much for that. If anyone has questions, please just feel free to write them in the chat, and then I'm sure we'll have 5-10 minutes at the end just to do some questions. So please just put any questions in the chat. Andrew.
Koutou katoa, ko Andrew Thompson. Thank you, kia ora, Alex and Hyejeong. That was really interesting and really helpful for us. Getting an outside perspective from Australia, from what's been going on in Victoria and New South Wales as well, has been going through some of these changes. And I thought I would just talk a little bit about what some of this stuff looks like from a New Zealand perspective. I won't share any slides now, but I will say that Sam and I will present some of the findings from this at the NZATE conference next month, and also kind of build on ideas that have been developed here. So for a lot of us, we have been looking at science of learning and it being kind of wrapped and intertwined with knowledge rich, that it's sort of hard to tease the two of them out. And one thing that I thought might be helpful for us to consider is how those two things might be distinct, and how it kind of plays out in our context of the curriculum in New Zealand. So by no means am I an expert on the science of learning, nor really the kind of origins of knowledge rich, but I've done some research into it, and I'll try to share that with you now. So knowledge rich often invokes the science of learning, and in our curriculum, sometimes it uses the knowledge rich to define what will be taught, the kind of content approach, whereas the science of learning is invoked to discuss the how, or the kind of pedagogy of what will be taught, and sometimes they're conflated, and as Alex discussed, that sort of oversimplification can turn into what some researchers out of La Trobe University have called lethal mutations of these two kind of terms. And so the knowledge rich has some origins in sociological studies, or like educational sociologists, particular Michael Young, and the powerful knowledge, which a lot of people will be aware of. And there's sort of a social realist slant on education, that everyone has a sort of democratic privilege or entitlement to knowledge of experts, that it shouldn't just be for experts, and expert knowledge should be sort of distributed freely for everyone. It shouldn't just be contained for elites. And I think that resonates with a lot of people. But on the other hand, that social realist model does tend towards that cultural heritage knowledge in its content, and in particular in our educational context in Aotearoa. Well, certainly not all social realists, but one of the Elizabeth Rata, who was a member of the ministerial advisory group and drafting sort of a response in sort of some early moments of our curriculum, is one of these educational sociologist who adheres to social realism, and we've sort of been critical of her cultural heritage inclusion. And so I think it's important to sort of see that strand as there's sort of one side that comes from that angle, and then the science of learning angle seems to come more from that cognitive theory element. But as Alex and Hyejeong, as you've shown really well, that that's not that simple, that there's quite a lot of complexity, and that the cognitive theory isn't one cognitive theory. And also that might be of interest to Nzate members is the work of Guy Claxton, who he's talked a lot about the sciences of learning, and you may have seen that was one of the things that was in the not included in the science of learning. And so Claxton has been contributing some videos and talks on the Aotearoa Educators Collective that might interest some members. Claxton says that there's also, I'm not going to summarize his work perfectly, but that good thinking derives from a wide variety of categories, and it's not as simple as a kind of efficient, accurate retrieval, that's complex, and that involves being both well-informed, but also being humble, and also being creative and imaginative, and tolerant of vagueness. It has to be systematic, but also it has to be contingent. And so there are I think those are really important things for us to consider as Alex said, that we are our own policymakers in our classrooms. And so having that kind of complex notion that the mind is not completely detached from our bodies, that we are embodied people as teachers and as students, as learners, and that we need to acknowledge that for them in our classrooms. But that having been said, it's a lot for us to take in as teachers to try to implement this stuff as well. And so while we have a fear, I think, collectively about the sort of I guess, intrusion, for lack of a better word, or sort of the imposition that there must be an increase in didactic teaching and direct instruction is kind of unsettling for a lot of us English teachers. So I think that it's also important to acknowledge that not every aspect of the science of learning, the things that might unsettle us, is a necessary evil as well. That because while it's complex, there's room for a lot of it to apply, that we don't want it to simply amount to retrieval. It should be more than that, but retrieval is important, and there are skills and methods that can produce those things efficiently. Use of whiteboard markers and for sort of whole class response to things, asking lots of questions and getting whole class feedback individually is really important. But it also matters what the questions are that we're asking. So it's sort of, we'll have to navigate this space as best we can, so that we are not sort of trapped into this compartmentalized learning that was described by our earlier speakers. I guess I'm curious to hear from our members, if you don't mind putting in the chat, just sort of what sort of things are you concerned about going forward, and how we would implement this stuff in our classrooms, because those are things that Sam and I can take back and share with people at the Nzate conference as well. Yeah, Sam, I think that that's pretty much all I really wanted to share for now. I was hoping that we might have some time for questions or comments.
Yeah, that was fantastic, Andrew. Thanks so much for that. And yeah, let me just thank everyone on the panel again for that kōrero. Really insightful. We definitely have 5 minutes or so for some questions, if anyone has questions. I'm going to abuse my privileges as host and just ask a question. I sort of still haven't formulated this in my head, but when I started teaching, inquiry learning was the rage. And, I remember a principal standing up at one point saying, it's no secret that we don't teach knowledge anymore because, one knowledge quickly, the idea is that it becomes redundant, things are moving so fast. So instead we teach skills, learning skills. I'm not sure if it was the same in Australia, Alex and Hyejeong, but I mean, I guess how did this happen? That's my question. What's led to this big shift? Has there been a similar shift in Australia? Like, is this part of an international tendency? I know that New Zealand went pretty hardcore on the inquiry learning stuff, I believe. And I have this question: if the so-called science of learning, I mean, I'm a supporter, I think, of the principles of science of learning on the whole. I really liked what you said, Alex, about the Shakespeare example, and we can't just stand there and drill facts into the heads of these young people. It's just cruel and it's inhumane and it's not effective teaching. But I guess my other question is, if these principles are so scientific, why haven't we always been doing them? Why now? When did these scientists of learning discover these great educational facts? So I know there's a few questions in there, but if you guys have any responses to those?
I'll try a few quick ones. Like we certainly don't have time to get into all of that, because I'd argue that what we've seen in recent decades, and maybe even longer, over half a century, is the leveraging of science to achieve particular goals. So once you apply scientific principles around truth, this becomes a way to then leverage particular outcomes. And I think that goes some way to understanding how this shift away from inquiry to explicit, because of the nature of evidence that can be produced by things like random control trials. And we've seen kind of like the scientification of education happening for a while now, right? It's not just now with the science of learning. It's been happening in lots of different forms for a period of time. It's certainly a global phenomenon, this move away from inquiry and towards claimed more science-based approaches to instruction. But I think it's also worth mentioning that it's happening in different ways in different contexts. And that's why it is really important to focus on the local ways in which it's happening. I mean, it happened for you guys almost overnight, right? A change of government, a new minister who is very sophisticated in how they communicate ideas. I would argue they're really impressive in how they communicate, and that gets traction. That they knew who to bring into the policy conversation, and as a result, and how to use mandates, how to decide and be confident in what they wanted, and to say, this is how we're doing it, and just doing it. I'll leave it there, because there's a lot more we could get into about how has this happened. It involves a real kind of historical, genealogical approach to get into the longer history.
If I have my quick comment. Science learning is not a new discipline. It's been always there. It just received so much media attention recently. So it's at my first slide, it's perfect. When you're looking at the history of this educational debate, it's nothing new. It's a swing of a pendulum. It's like it comes and goes. So just like reading walls. And then when you're looking at the phonics debate, that's my area of expertise. I look at the 100 years of phonics debate, meaning phonics. It comes and goes. So, I mean, with the network, within the highly effective network that Alex presented, and along with what is considered evidence that is measured by associations such as Arrow or many other, quasi-government organizations provide how to measure what is considered evidence, and maybe sort of a cherry picking, in my view, way of which evidence is justified and selected to present. I think all those kind of combinations have brought about the science of learning. But although it's so important, what you see in the media and the policy is very different, not very. It is a very narrow version of what science of learning is about. When you actually look discussing wide range of scholars within the science of learning, including University of Melbourne, their version of science of learning is slightly different from what you see in the media. That's danger. And then policy and media kind of marry together, present this is the only way of presenting science learning. That's my concern. But then, as a guy Claxton talking about science of learning, that should be field of science of learning. Although current discourse kind of disagree, but it's again media discourse. I would say policy discourse, media discourse.
There's just a good question in the chat for you there, Hyejeong. What do you think the political agenda is behind that cherry picking that you mentioned?
So we are in the discourse of a crisis, right? The literacy, that's my view. I haven't done any empirical studies, although I did some, I have a linguistic background, so I'm looking at the language use, how media use frame the language. So I feel there are huge crisis mode at the happening. New Zealand, PIRA results and Australians, not what's the word? The OECD, PISA, that's right. PISA results and it's declining. So at the crisis of media, at the literacy crisis, politicians and educators are duty to do something about it. And then with a combination of that, I think this science of learning, science of reading came about as a way to fixing the problem. I think that's what kind of motivated it. Although there are lots of studies supporting science of learning, but again, theory and pedagogy, when that translation got bit, theory is fantastic, really, really good. And how it translated in pedagogy, it's become so narrowly defined. I think that's when the actors and played a big role in this. How the organized network, how present evidence as only truths, that they played huge role, I think. That's it.
Do you mind if I chime in just a little? Um, just that I completely agree that this sort of science of learning is nothing new, and that back to the days of Dewey and progressive education, there's a great book by a woman named Ellen Lagerman who talks about how the elusive science of teacher education, and how on the one camp there was the Dewey-based sort of inquiry or child-centered approach to learning in his experimental school, and on the other side there were educational psychologists like Thorndike, and that these two camps were in competition with each other, and one sort of viewed education as an art, where Dewey's side, whereas another side saw it very much as a science. And these two camps kind of went in different directions, and one became the science of learning in this American progressive educational context became sort of the overseers of policy, statistical collection, and kind of teacher oversight, kind of the educational review offices of American supervision, whereas the Dewey side became the teacher training colleges, that domain, more or less. And I think we're seeing a real suspicion of the art of teaching from government actors and those knowledge brokers that Alex was discussing, that there's a mistrust of sort of teachers because of the results of these low literacy rates, that they don't want to leave anything to chance and think that there must be this coherent, structured approach that cannot fail if we apply these certain principles. And I think that we know that I'm sure that a lot of these principles could be successful, but also we do have skill, art, imagination, and judgment that can and not only enhance, but really overcome other obstacles that they might not foresee.
And I might jump in also and just take one part of Jack's question around the political agenda and apply it not to science of learning, but to knowledge rich, because I know you guys are being hammered by knowledge rich language. And there's a deeply conservative agenda around knowledge rich. Unfortunately, one of the worst things that Australia has done to English teaching is compulsory text lists, where teachers can only teach texts from a list. Because what that allows government to do is determine which texts matter, which knowledge matters in advance of a classroom. And I know there's some of that's made its way into the most recent iteration of your most recent draft of the English curriculum. And that ties into knowledge rich, because the questions immediately become, well, whose knowledge? That they're age-old questions. But once you have a text list, someone in authority is the ultimate arbiter of which knowledge. And it's never English teachers. Make absolutely no mistake. English teachers will not get to decide what go on those lists, because the point of the list is to move agency away from teachers and to move it to someone else. So once you have compulsory text lists, it allows those who have authority over the list to determine which knowledge, what constitutes knowledge rich. And I understand that those debates around, whether Shakespeare should be mandatory, whether, this all ties into those questions around knowledge rich. So the political agenda is a very obvious one in that instance. It's less obvious with science of learning, but with knowledge rich, it's very clear. It's about kind of buffeting students from the knowledge that those who decide, so that there's control over that knowledge and that teachers don't have that control. And there's no hiding away from that. That's made very obvious by advocates of knowledge rich. They want to decide what constitutes the knowledge rich.
If no one else has questions, I think that note would be a great one to finish on. That one that I think will resonate with most of our members. Alex, the comment there on compulsory text lists. I just want to thank Alex, Hyejeong, and Andrew for taking the time to talk with us today. Fascinating conversation, as I knew it would be. I still have about 30 questions in my head, but I might have to save those for later. And yeah, this talk has been recorded, and we'll send that out to everyone who registered and tuned in today. So yeah, please feel free obviously to take Alex up on his on Alex and Hyejeong on their offer of that PhD candidacy. It's pretty awesome offer there. I think that'd be amazing. So anyway, thank you all for coming, and I'll let you get home. And haere rā.